Hi everyone, it's the third weekend of April and this is the weekly broadcast. I got a little bit of a live audience here with me, but that's okay. So I want to just do a quick recap of the three previous episodes. So I previously talked about how, everything is systems within systems and all the systems got to grow, but they can't. I talked about how inefficiencies will build up due to the concept of moral hazard, which is basically shifting responsibility away from those who need to have it. And I talked about how these processes will naturally lead towards totalitarianism over time, especially as this top level umbrella super system starts to stagnate, which in our current situation is this new international order, post World War II international order. So, and then I talked about post Cold War, really. Then I talked about emergence, how nations emerge from people, and how just like how mind emerges from your brain cells, and how your thoughts are often not really your real thoughts. And I talked about how all of this can lead to groupthink, which can become more abusive as the system keeps trying to convince itself that its drifting and false version of reality is just as good as the real version of reality. And then I tried to make the point that in the real reality, we have a need to live with purpose so that we can become somebody that we can admire by identifying who we are, who our people are, and taking on responsibility for our people and then fulfilling those obligations. And I said last week that the point of the above purpose is so that when you die, you can tell yourself that you are worth the investment from the forces that created you because you realized your potential for conferring benefit to your surroundings. But I don't think that's quite right. I want to make a slight correction. The idea is to be able to, in the present, convince yourself that you could be able to convince yourself of that when you die. So it's a small distinction. But anyway, just on the topic of truth, I just think that despite popular belief these days, the truth isn't just an opinion. There are facts in this world about the world and about ourselves that we were actually supposed to be figuring out before this whole scientific process got completely bastardized. But more on that a little bit later. I want to talk about ideological subversion. So there's this really famous high-level Cold War defector from the Soviet Union, from the KGB, named Yuri Bezmenov. And in a really famous 1984 interview, he talks about basically the Marxist ideological subversion of the West, and specifically America. And he says that this is actually the main thing that the KGB was concerned with, more than espionage. More than collecting information, the KGB's goal was about propagating information. And this ideological subversion accounted for 85% of the KGB's resource allocation. So ideological subversion, or in Russian it's called aktivnie мероприятия, is a slow process, and it's intended to change the perception of reality of Westerners, to confuse them about what's actually true or false, so as to impair their ability to defend their society. So it's a long brainwashing process that's divided into four stages. So the first stage is demoralization. So basically removing the morals from a society. And that takes 15 to 30 years. It's about the time that it takes to educate a generation with an ideology that is meant to attack basic Western values. So um, he talks about basically these people who graduated in the 1960s, these like dropouts and half-baked intellectuals who then came to occupy positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, education, who just can't be gotten rid of and who are programmed to think and react to a certain stimuli in a certain patterns. It's kind of like a modern secular priesthood, kind of like the way that now big tech companies try to make themselves the arbiter of truth. They get to decide what's true and what's false, but they don't understand that they actually are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. Even if you show people that are in this state proof that white is white and black is black, you still can't change their basic perception because their logical processes have been completely contaminated. And basically, the source of the contamination is the root of the root of the postmodern idea, which is that nothing is true, everything is just opinions. So all the systems that you see today, they're not the result of us actually trying to make a genuine effort to figure out what the best systems are. It's just a result of white supremacy and whatever. And these useful idiots are the first ones that would be marked for extermination by the very system they seek to import, because the psychological shock when they will see, he quotes, I have a quote here, the psychological shock when they will see in the future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice. Obviously, they will revolt, and they will be very unhappy, frustrated people. And the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. It's kind of like how Julius Caesar allegedly said that he loved treason, but he hated traitors. Just because you sell yourself out to the enemy doesn't make the enemy like you. So basically, the demoralization process in the West under his analysis was already completed at that time in 1984. And he commented that the demoralization process had actually been completed better than the Soviet Union's most optimistic dreams, because most of it ended up being done by Americans to other Americans, thanks to a lack of moral standards. So this lack of moral standards kind of spreads like a virus. Almost like they just needed to roll the snowball down the hill, and then these kinds of processes perpetuate themselves. And that kind of fits in with the idea that I've been coming back to over and over, that human systems are inherently designed to grow because all the systems that don't grow just get replaced by the ones that do grow. So I have another quote here. He says, as I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who is demoralized is unable to access true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures. Even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him the concentration camps, he will refuse to believe it until he's going to receive a kick in his own fat bottom. When the military brute crushes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That is the tragedy of the situation of demoralization. So basically, when somebody has grown up in a system that has intentionally demoralized them, the idea is that this process can't be reversed. I don't know if I would take that cynical of a view, but the idea is that once it's implemented on a societal level, you basically have to train a whole new generation. And this is a really troubling conclusion, because it means that you need counter brainwashing. You can't just set the people free and hope that invisible hands steer society back to course. And if you let the problem be, the problem of demoralization will be passed down through generations. And there's a lot of other disturbing implications of this. Anyways, the next step is destabilization. So once a society's been demoralized, the destabilization process can take 2 to 5 years. And during this time, what matters is essentials. So economy, foreign relations, defense systems. Every aspect of these has to be completely drenched in Marxism. And this has been done. Everything is woke. Our economic policy comes from a woke perspective. Our foreign relations comes from this anti-Western woke perspective. Even our defense systems, like you have gender and race quotas in army recruitment, as if that's going to help us defend ourselves. But it comes from this idea that we don't need to defend ourselves. But you can think about modern monetary theory, this whole new idea that you can just print money and nothing bad will happen, and that taxes should actually be used to punish bad behaviors rather than to actually pay for its spending. You can also see it in appeasement, the way that we try to appease the government of China instead of realizing that they consider us their mortal enemy that needs to be destroyed at all costs. Anyway, so that process is basically done. And then the next stage is crisis. So the crisis only needs to take, around 6 weeks or so, he says. And basically the crisis is supposed to act as a catalyst for all of this demoralization and destabilization to lead to a new normal, a reset, a great reset if you want. And so the fourth and final step of ideological subversion is normalization, and this stage is indefinite. And it's so interesting that even in 1984, he describes these processes in these terms: demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization. And this is exactly what we've seen in our society today. You can, even just the words that the elites use to describe the current situation there, you can hear them talk about, needing a reset, needing to find a new normal, all of this kind of stuff. So what's the goal of all of this ideological subversion? Well, the goal is, while promising all sorts of free stuff and paradise on earth, they destabilize the economy, they eliminate the principle of free market competition, and put a big brother government in charge. And then the USA, the idea would have been that the USA would become ideologically aligned with the USSR. And even though the USSR doesn't exist anymore, you can still see that the USA is becoming more ideologically aligned with them, and also the still existing Chinese Communist Party. So his last warning was that once totalitarianism takes over the West, unlike him, we will have nowhere left to defect to, unless we want to live with Antarctica with the penguins. And so these processes of ideological subversion can actually happen naturally without any conspiring forces, just by many different actors according to their own interests. Because actors will act in arrogance, and because they don't understand the true underlying motivations of their own actions, while other actors will hold on a second. It's so actors will act in arrogance, and it's because they don't understand the true underlying motivations of their own actions. So I'll bring you back to last week's episode where I talked about how sometimes the stories that we tell ourselves about the motivations for our own actions are actually false, and we're not aware that they're false. And then there are other actors still that are just going to comply with the power structure because the power structure itself has confounded compliance with virtue, kind of like how I discussed last week under when I tried to explain groupthink. And, being able to admire yourself is still on our hierarchy of needs, below food, water, shelter, and energy, but it's still on there. And and the reason why I think the Soviets were so surprised at how successful this was in the West is because ideological subversion is actually a necessary byproduct of centralization, because decentralized thought is a danger to centralizing forces. This is because centralization just doesn't work, as I explained, in the previous broadcast. And then for centralization to perpetuate itself, self-perpetuation being an inherent need for any viable system, it needs to shift the groupthink away from the state of reality to avoid this reality that central planning of complex structures is just something that humans are not capable of. So ideological subversion is basically about creating a groupthink by creating a new thought anchor to replace whatever previous anchor there was, which is why our current society is losing its sense of reality. In order to perpetuate itself, a centralizing system will have to bring about a destruction of the old systems. And it's kind of reminiscent of the motto from China's Cultural Revolution, where they killed tens of millions of their own people. And the motto is that you need to destroy the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. So this is why old models of morality are destroyed in order to make way for a more centralized version of morality, or in other words, like a new secular Catholic Church. And the how is just my previous explanations of emergence and groupthink. So on that note, I want to talk about deconstructionism in the West. So, you have all of these new concepts like microaggressions, privilege, whiteness, cultural appropriation, and these are all phenomena that are naturally designed, not necessarily through conspiracy. They're designed to take the morality away from down to earth to basically a new version of reality where central planning actually works and it's not just completely retarded. And if you look now around what our society is doing socially speaking, you can maybe it's easier for me to see this as an immigrant, but the West has basically lost its cultural sanity. And I think the psychological base of this loss of cultural sanity is self-hate. So I think I think at the very bottom of it, you do have this root of anti-Protestantism and white guilt. And consider the last time you saw any form of Christianity portrayed in any positive light in any popular media, or the last time you saw any other religion portrayed in a negative light in any of our modern popular media. We're in the middle of a cultural revolution only unlike the Cultural Revolution of Maoist China in its chronicity. We are seeking to destroy our old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas to make way for a new totalitarian version of morality, where people, where the Twitter blue check priesthood tells you what is right and wrong instead of you having to think for yourself. And like I said, I think it subconsciously boils down to self-hatred. And obviously it's not unique to this culture. I think it's something deeper that's underlying within all people. And I think comes from self-hatred, from not coming to terms with one's own mortality, and then projecting this self-hatred onto the world around them in the form of anti-humanist sentiments, which drives this desire to centralize and to create something bigger than ourselves in the form of micromanaging governments, instead of realizing that the something bigger already exists as an emergent property, naturally, without having to conspire, because they're scared of the idea that they might actually be the source of their own unhappiness because of their unwillingness to constrain their actions within a moral code that reflects the existence of that something bigger. And I think that this acts as a justification for abolishing the sacred and releasing oneself from the constraints of morality. Consider the xenophilia, so the opposite of xenophobia. That is maybe the most common manifestation of white guilt, which is just another way of describing the self-hatred of one's own Western Protestant traditions and culture. A fascinating side note is that this xenophilia, which you can also describe as a fetishization of the exotic, was also present in the late Bronze and Roman ages, almost as if it is one of the decentralization processes that form a part of the civilization cycles that I described in the first broadcast. Now, I have a quote here from a history documentary series about the Roman Empire, and it might sound a little familiar to you today. So, quote, Gaius grew up in Rome, doing menial jobs and a lot of drinking. Like millions of poor Romans, he lived on welfare handouts of grain and mindless distraction, lots of it. Intent on distracting themselves, most Romans did not notice that the social fabric of the empire was shredding all around them. Rome's sense of community had disappeared. The elite were increasingly isolated from the poor. Educated Romans were turning their backs on anything to do with old Rome, not just their poor. The East, ancient and mysterious and exotic, seemed much more enticing. Wealthy Romans headed off to see the sights of Egypt. The world's first tourist boom had begun. The Roman delight in far-flung places was not reciprocated. As Rome thrilled to the exotic East was starting to hate Rome's guts. In the provinces of the periphery of the empire, resentment festered. And that's the end of the quote. But is there any wonder why the periphery would resent a self-hating yet self-righteous hegemonic empire? I mean, what a joke! Like, if you combine self-hate with self-righteousness, you really come to this this like blatant hypocrisy that you see all around us today. The first example that pops into my head is just how none of the politicians follow their own COVID rules. It's rules for me, but rules for thee and not for me, right? And I think that when there's a hegemonic culture that comes to the state of mixing this self-hatred with this self-righteousness, it represents a threat to all cultures, including even itself. And it also represents exactly where we find ourselves today. History is rhyming with itself. That's how we delude ourselves into thinking anything other than that China and Russia despise the West and its cultural values, both old and new. No wonder newer immigrants to the West have trouble assimilating, when there's no longer even a strong Western culture to assimilate into. It's just yet another problem with our society with respect to which we have backed ourselves into a corner in terms of actually being able to solve. Think about the cancellation of old classic books like Tom Sawyer, Three Musketeers, and Frankenstein for failing to represent racial tolerance and diversity. This is not about becoming a more moral society. That's a post-justification like I described last week. This is really about the decentralizing process of a reflexive opposition to the substratum culture of the civilization. They think that they're against racism, but they're not. They're actually against the underlying substratum culture itself. And they want to find a replacement, basically, for the traditional church within this new church of woke, in which the government will create heaven on earth, as long as we all offer our complete submission. If it doesn't work out, then it wasn't real socialism. We didn't properly offer our complete submission to this imaginary deity of central planning. The centralization part of the civilization cycle is marked by naive and self-righteous beginnings, while the decentralization of the civilization cycle is marked by self-contemptuous deconstructionism. And in this lens, if you've been listening to the previous broadcasts and somehow managed to be paying attention, you can put together what I think is the real picture, that white guilt and modern cancel culture is merely a byproduct of the big civilization reaching diminishing marginal returns. And the subsystems, or in other words, the groups within the civilization system, are preparing for increasingly desperate competition. The big overarching umbrella identity is dying, and we are emotionally trying to find a new subsystem identity that makes sense for us and that we can trust to generate benefit through cooperation, even if that benefit comes at the cost of the other subsystems, because the super system isn't generating benefit through cooperation anymore because it's reached diminishing marginal returns. All the low-hanging fruit have been picked already. So our former allies are now turned enemies through the clash of the now competing self-interests. So basically, it's like the idea that I talked about before about how friends turn into enemies in the face of scarcity. And even if the manifestation for that competition remains as petty virtue signaling, wealth signaling, or intelligence signaling within today's society, just think about how desperate everybody is to try to show everybody how good they are, how smart they are, how wealthy they are. And like I said before, like I've explained previously a bit, once the state is made into God, then the state can never admit that it's wrong about anything, because that legitimizes its claim to absolute authority, and it needs to keep its authority because every human system needs to grow, or else it will have been or will in the future be replaced by a system that is better designed to grow. So China having to double down on zero COVID in order to justify its existence is like a good example of that. It can't admit that it was wrong, because if it was wrong, it shouldn't have absolute power. So even as a virus with a less than 1% mortality rate supposedly spreads through the city of Shanghai, the bigger threat is people starving in their homes because they're not allowed out by the government. But they can never admit that their cost-benefit analysis was wrong, because if they can be wrong, then maybe they shouldn't have a complete authority over everything. But when you put all the society's eggs in the central basket, it's only a time before the central planners drop the basket. And before long, they'll gaslight you into thinking that the basket wasn't dropped. And then they'll try to convince you that it's not a big deal that the basket was dropped. And then eventually it'll be your fault that they dropped the basket. And much later, architects of a future Tower of Babel will look back and claim that they've learned the lessons of history, and this time they'll implement central planning properly. Let's just try it one more time. Real socialism this time, even though they'll repeat all of the same mistakes for all of the same reasons. It's like how the original builders of the Tower of Babel became unable to communicate with each other because they abandoned their anchor to the nature of reality as we've been adapted to perceive it. Every attempt at pushing centralization beyond its means results in factionalism. Which is like splintering off, which is why you see progressives, whether the old Bolsheviks or the new social justice warriors, fall into fractal infighting at every level, or they realize that they have to create a totalitarian state of fear and suppression, which is where Stalinism comes from. So Stalinism didn't arise because one man was evil. It's because Leninism leads to infinite infighting and you can never get anything done. And the whole point of a dictatorship of the proletariat was to try to get things done. Anyways, I want to relate all of this to the World Economic Forum, which has become, a more popular topic in recent days. It relates to, everything I've been saying about totalitarianism. So I want to just put another axiom on the table. So a standard of living times its population is just the amount of energy it uses. Or another way to think about that is the standard of living of a population is its energy use divided by its population. Basically, To have a better standard of living, you have to be able to use more energy. And if you graph energy use to population over the post-industrial period, it matches up pretty well. The thing is, population grows exponentially, but energy does not grow exponentially. If energy actually did grow exponentially, then the pollution would grow exponentially, and quickly it would reach a threshold point where we actually do kill ourselves. Um, and the global elite today, they don't care about climate change. They care about maintaining their own energy use so that they can maintain their own standard of living. Exponential population growth is a huge problem for those in charge of this big super system, especially without a huge decrease in the standard of living. Um, and you might, be tempted to solve these problems with, a pandemic or hyperinflation or maybe World War III, you know? So I just want to go through like a little bit of history. So in 1968, there was a group called the Club of Rome, and one of its founding members was actually Pierre Trudeau, Justin's stepfather, because we all know that Castro is his real father, um, and basically this was like a group of elites. This is like the predecessor of the Davos Forum of Economics, or where um, these different elites came together and they basically tried to um, collude and come to some sort of um, basically collective understanding as to how humanity should go forward. And then 3 years later, in 1971, Klaus Schwab starts the World Economic Forum. More on that later. The next year, in 1972, the Club of Rome comes out with a paper called Limits to Growth. And it's based on this idea from someone named Malthus. So this is where the word Malthusian trap comes from. So when I talk about Malthusian trap, I'm talking about something quite different from the original idea of the Malthusian trap. So when I say Malthusian trap, I mean just factors that will lead to us going into a dead end that leads to mass depopulation. And when Malthus originally came up with the term, it was more about just the fact that we wouldn't be able to expand our food supply fast enough to maintain our population growth. So that basically you'd have to like thin the herd. You basically, because the original Malthusian idea is that there are finite resources on the earth, and we need to intentionally reduce that consumption of resources, even if it's by destruction of the population. So in 1973, the main founder of the Club of Rome gives a speech at the World Economic Forum about the limits to growth, which is a paper that basically advocated for population destruction. And in attendance was Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum. And on a side note, there was actually this simulation where MIT scientists tried to simulate. Okay, so let me start over. So basically, scientists at MIT plugged these like Malthusian ideas into a complex simulation that would try to take account of big picture trends and then project those trends out to basically from 1980 to 2020. And they basically predicted that pollution would start reaching a threshold in its exponential growth and start killing people. So the idea I'm trying to plant is that if they're thinking that we're going to kill ourselves anyway, why wouldn't they justify to themselves killing us first so that that if we're going to die anyway, we might as well die causing less damage to the environment, right? And so ever since then, the World Economic Forum has been ever since the 1973 speech, where Klaus Schwab was, the World Economic Forum has been all about centralized control, more and more centralized control, so that they can bring about the reduction in our energy use. And they think they're so smart because they see the bigger picture and they wouldn't mind killing a billion people here and there to save the planet. But they are so dumb because they don't understand that their actions are driven by their feelings And the narratives that they use to justify those feelings are actually after the fact justifications, just as I described in last week's broadcast about how you actually have two brains. And actually, they'll do whatever it takes to save their own standard of living at everyone else's expense, while convincing themselves that it's for the planet, not for themselves. Just like your clever verbal left brain would. That'll make sense if you listen to last week's thing about the brains. But the thing is, God doesn't give a fuck about what your narratives are. These ungrateful elites really think they can run this complicated system that emerged out of cultures and nations because they don't understand what they've been given. They really don't understand that their standard of living depends on this living, breathing system that they are holding back from being able to reform itself in the best way that it knows, through the free market, which is an emergent property of economic entities interacting in certain patterns and acting according to the feedback they get, which acts as though it is a higher collective consciousness. And they really think that they are these, transcendent gods that have just figured out how to take a shortcut to creating heaven on earth through micromanaging the most complex super system that has ever existed on this earth. But it's too bad that they're just mere mortals who will die someday and don't even recognize that their talking brain is just generating post-justification narratives for their monkey brains, and tell them that the super system is stagnating and that they need to grab as much of everyone else's stuff as possible while they can, because they know that we're going to come for them, so they want to come for us first. And I really think that they psychologically really have this need to think of themselves as non-human, because that's the next step on their hierarchy of needs. Their mortality disgusts them. Mortality is death, and death is gross. That's why they don't recognize their monkey brains at work, because to recognize that you even have a monkey brain is to recognize that you're mortal flesh and blood. So basically gross. And our brains will always prefer to feel not gross over feeling gross, so they don't associate with humanity. They are anti-humanist. That's why they don't want you to have kids. That's why they don't want humans to have biological differences between men and women, because they don't want any of that gross stuff. It reminds them that they are flesh and blood that are going to die. But of course, they have to generate this narrative for why these rules apply to thee and not for me. And the narrative is that they are these transcendent gods who can micromanage the super system and save what this planet has in store from them, from those disgusting humans. And this is what the World Economic Forum and its Project Syndicate is all about. You will own nothing and be happy. You will eat the bugs. And you don't control, and if you, as the Chinese Communist Party has been saying these days, if you don't control your soul's desire for freedom, then they will just do what Trudeau did and shut down your bank account. And so hopefully this helps you understand why there are so many of these depopulation conspiracy theories around. And maybe you'll understand that one of those theories is probably true, and none of these depopulation promoting processes rely on conspiracies. They can arise on their own just through independent actors all acting according to their own self-interest. So I'm just going to leave this week's broadcast. It's a little bit shorter, but I'll just leave it here. And next week I'll talk about what I think are the big decentralization forces at work against the mega centralization force of the World Economic Forum. And in that context, what my outlook is for the next 150 years or so. But I think that decentralization wins because centralization just doesn't work. The elites, in their foolish pride, would destroy themselves even by succeeding. The forces of God are ultimately stronger than the forces of man, and whatever. If you want to think about it in a more secular way, you can also think about it like this. If the ultimate centralization, global totalitarianism, is going to work, then we can't do anything to prepare for it anyway. So we might as well just kill ourselves or give in. And at that point, who are we to say that those brilliant elites who can achieve such a thing as that shouldn't run our world as they want to? Who are we to say that that's not better if it's going to work out anyway? So that possibility isn't really worth considering because it's not, it can't possibly benefit you from a game theory perspective. So the dominant strategy is to assume that centralization fails and that we will enter another decentralization period, just as we've done over and over again in the past. And if you're right, then great. Maybe you actually got off your fat ass and actually did something to prepare for the inevitable. If you're wrong, then fuck, you were fucked anyway. So at least you had something to apply yourself to. Maybe at least you had some sort of hobby while you awaited your eventual and inevitable demise. So decentralization wins. Find out next week. And on that pleasant note, thanks for listening, and I hope you tune in again next week.